how did you get involved in bees personally? Like, why, what started your interest in bees?
Well, I kind of laugh at that because it's just such a random experience that pulled me into it by accident. But you know what? I think that that's kind of a shared experience among beekeepers. Something occurs and you just get interested, and then you make the mistake of getting started, and then it becomes an obsession. That's pretty much universal truth. For me, I grew up out in the country in Central Ohio, but I didn't really know any beekeepers. But then my senior year of high school, I got a job building swimming pools, and we put a pool in for a hobby beekeeper. And there I was digging a hole on hot days in the middle of the summer, very close to just, I don't know if it was maybe 3 hives or so that this guy had, and they were just nice hobby hives, everything perfect and precise on nice stands. And it just struck my curiosity, and I thought, man, I'm going to do that sometime. And so a couple of years later, I had moved down to Kentucky by then, and I started 2 hives. I got them from Walter T. Kelly, which is a Kentucky bee supplier. Drove over there, picked up my hives, picked up my packages, got everything set out, and started off with my first hives in spring. I was brewing beer as a home brewer, still kind of am when I have time. And I thought, man, it'd be pretty fun to make mead, honey mead, that's fermented honey, kind of like a wine, or maybe some honey beers with that. And I figured I would just have those 2 hives and use it like that, and maybe give away honey around Thanksgiving to my friends and family. And I got obsessed. And the 2 hives, just grew in number. And I went back to grad school. I was in school for forestry at that time, and I switched. It's kind of a rough time for foresters during those years. So I switched very late on in my education over to entomology, which is insect studies, and learned about pollination ecology. And I worked a lot with bumblebees in greenhouse environments, and it just grows, right? There's just no end to the learning. The more you learn with this kind of stuff, the more fascinated you get, and the more you realize that you don't know anything at all, and there's so much more to learn. And so it just continues to snowball year after year. But that's my story, and I think it's pretty universally shared among beekeepers.
That's awesome. Well, Andy, we have quite a few questions that came in. Do bees migrate south in the winter?
Ooh, good question, right? That migration is a fascinating sort of thing when you think honeybees do not migrate on their own, right? A honeybee hive is very directly related to the environment that it lives in. And so if we think of bees that live in, say, the hollow tree, kind of, more or less feral out there on their own without a beekeeper, they're inside that tree on combs that they've built, and they stay there year in and year out and don't move. Now, swarms help them move, kind of as the colony spreads itself through the extended environment. But in theory, that honeybee colony continues on through years in the same exact spot without changing. But the reason why that migratory sort of context is interesting is we move bees around, right? Especially with our agriculture systems that we have now. But people have moved bees for eons, right? The Egyptians supposedly moved bees way back when up and down the rivers there for pollination without even realizing exactly on a scientific level what was going on. They knew they needed bees in certain areas at different times a year, so they'd put them on barges and move them. And nowadays, we move a lot of bees on semi-loads. I showed you that one picture way towards the beginning of the talk of bees all stacked up in a holding yard. Those were going to go onto a semi and go out to California, like I mentioned, and that's our biggest draw. But we also have beekeepers that go down to Texas to avoid an Iowa winter and get an earlier spring build up there. We've got beekeepers that might go over into cranberries in neighboring states. We have a couple that get permits for that. So we move bees around quite a bit for pollination efforts. Like I said, almonds probably being by far the biggest one that we move out of state to go to, but we also move them around in state for things like apple and vegetable garden pollination. I've got some bees personally right now, just a couple hives, 8 of them, on Will's Family Orchards. Maybe some of you know Will's Orchards. It's a very special place over in Adel, and I'm one of his pollinators these last couple of years. And I really enjoy doing that sort of thing. It's fun just to be a part of it on some small level.
All right, next question is, how much honey do bees make per year?
Wow, that's another one that's maybe more complicated than what it might seem on the surface. So here in Iowa, it's all very local, right? If we were talking about this in a different part of the world, it'd be a whole different number, right? Because bees are so connected to the seasons, the length of summer, the types of plants, flowering plants that are all around them. And so here in Iowa, we do a pretty good job making honey, right? Our bees are pretty productive, and they make that 5 gallons or so on average per year, and that's surplus. So that's what we can take away from them, while leaving them everything that they need for their own good too. And we can come in and supplementally feed as beekeepers if fall doesn't happen, for the bees, and it's cold and it's rainy and there's not much bloom. Of course, we can supplement that food, but we can still take that 5 gallon bucket of honey and hopefully leave them enough for their own use. Honey weighs 12 pounds per gallon, so that 5 gallons, if you've noticed, I keep saying that's 60 pounds of surplus per hive per year. Some years it's way more than that, and some years it's maybe half that. And that's what an average is, right? Some years you do better. Every year you hope to do better than the previous one. But notice that I'm just really talking and measuring surplus honey. So the bees need way more than 60 pounds of honey for their own good, right? So we might leave the colony with 80 or 90 pounds of honey for their own use still in the hive as they go through fall and into winter, so that they don't starve to death before springtime comes around. And every day throughout the warm season, of course, those foragers need fuel, right? So they're loading up on honey before they fly out of the hive every journey that they go on. And so I couldn't tell you exactly what that adds up to, but I'm sure it's in the hundreds and hundreds of pounds per year that they consume for their own existence too. So very, very productive insects.
Andy, is there a particular species of plant or flowers that make the best honey?
Oh, now we could get into opinions, that sort of a thing. Again, I'm going to just continue to brag up Iowa honey, right? And we all know that there's Manuka honey, coming in from other parts of the world that might have special medical benefits. We might have citrus honey coming in from different states, or sourwood is a famously good honey, or sage honey, some years from California areas, and those are all really special too. But our Iowa clover and or wildflower honeys, the honeys that our bees make in this part, this prairie rich, heritage here that we have here through the upper Midwest, I think is very special. Our honey is light in color, it's floral, it's very fragrant, and kind of a mild, very sweet floral taste to it. And just for your general use, I don't think you could do any better. And that is associated with not the types of bees that we keep or anything. It's associated with the plants that they're gathering the nectar from. So these bees are collecting largely from our clovers, right? White Dutch clover here pretty soon will come into bloom. And then following that, we'll see maybe some yellow sweet clover and then some white sweet clover, the big, tall, kind of gangly looking plants in a roadside. Those are really good honey producing plants for us. And that's a really nice light colored nectar that comes in very floral and sweet. We have basswood trees or linden trees. That is very important. Fluctuates year to year how much we get off of those, but when it hits good and hard and can really provide a lot of nectar. Has kind of a minty flavor. That's one of my favorites. Another person might not like it, but I absolutely love basswood honey. And then it goes on through, usually in the springtime, we'll have lighter color nectars, and then as the summer goes on towards fall, it'll become darker and darker. We'll end the season up with goldenrod and asters, and in my opinion, those are not the tastiest, not the lightest colors, and they're best left in the hive for bee food. So we extract in late August or first week of September, and usually then we still have plenty of bloom left in those asters and goldenrods and the miscellaneous things that are out there for the bees. But yeah, I really like a good clover basswood honey mix, and that's exactly what we're producing here. It's really just A+ type honey.
Andy, our next question asks how long a bee will live.
Oh, I skipped over all that and I didn't really mean to. That's a great question. Well, we have those 3 different types of bees in a hive, right? So those workers doing all the work, they're wearing their bodies out. And as any parent will attest, I'm sure, especially now that we're all spending so much time home together, it wears on you, right? that development of the next generation takes its toll on these worker bees, and that more than anything else really wears them out. And so a worker bee going through winter, they can make it all the way from, say, Thanksgiving time until the following spring, months. But a worker bee in the middle of the season, like right now going through summer, might only live maybe 5 weeks or so. And part of that is that brood care that they do. It kind of depletes their reserves and causes changes in their hormones of their body, and accelerates aging. And then of course just the physicality of flying miles and miles and miles on a daily basis, collecting and collecting and collecting all these resources for the high front flowers. And so they wear their bodies out in about a month and a half. Now the queen, she's in there and well cared for, and she'll live over a year typically. You might have a queen that lives even longer than 2 years periodically. Used to say about 2 years was average life of a queen. Now we say about a year, right? And that's just kind of one of the indicators that it just isn't what it used to be in terms of bee health and the ease of being a beekeeper. But yep, a queen will live a long time longer than a worker. And then drones basically live for a season, right? Since they're there for mating and they die afterwards, if they're fortunate enough to mate with that virgin queen out there, their life could be pretty short. But if they're not successful in their one task that they're given from birth in mating, if they're not successful with that and they never get it accomplished, then basically what happens is as fall approaches, their sisters kick them out of the hive and don't let them come in. And you'll see that usually around, say, Halloween time here in Iowa with our climate. You'll see all those drones kind of just like hovering around the hive, listlessly trying to get back in, but the entrance is guarded by their sisters, and they'll die on a cold night, kind of depressingly, usually around the end of October, beginning of November. So a drone might live for several months, or if it is very fortunate and it's one of the lucky ones, then it won't live for very long at all. So kind of another one of those tricky answers, but I think it also lends to the fascination of bees, right? The more you learn about them, the more you realize there's just no short, simple answers. And I think the complexity of this is the beauty of it, and that's what makes it so fascinating. Good question.
Andy, our next one kind of piggybacks on the last one, but how is the queen bee selected? Does she start out as a worker bee, or can you kind of explain how she becomes the queen?
When the queen, the existing queen, lays an egg, she has a little valve in her body, and it allows her to basically inseminate that egg as she lays the egg in the cell with the input from the drone, right? So if it's a fertilized egg, it's going to become a female bee. But if it's just egg with no father, right, no input from the drone, if she holds that valve closed, then it's an unfertilized egg, and that will become a drone, right? So their genetics are very different from ours. And so an unfertilized egg is going to be a male bee. A fertilized egg has the potential to be a female. So at the time that it's an egg, depending on what the colony needs, it could be a worker or a queen. And so if the queen is in good shape and she isn't removed by the beekeeper or somehow, crushed or aging out, where the bees feel like they need to replace her, if everything is good, well, those fertilized eggs will just become more and more workers, right? And just build up the mass of that colony into this huge workforce. But if something would happen, I'll just say I'll remove the queen, 2 days or so after she laid that egg, that puts the bees into an emergency kind of state. And so they can take that recently hatched egg, a very young larva, fertilized one that's going to become a female, and when it was laid, it was going to become a worker bee. But in this emergency scenario where all of a sudden the colony finds itself queenless, they can take that young larva and build it up into a queen. And they do that basically like, is it nature or nurture? It's all in the nurture, right? It's they feed it royal jelly. You might have heard of royal jelly, and that is a very protein and fat-rich food that they secrete from glands in their head, in their jaws, and they can feed it just copious amounts of that royal jelly. And they give that larva a lot more care than what they would if it was just going to become another worker bee sister of theirs. And all that extra care and extra food in a bigger cell to develop in and pupate in, and out will come a queen in about 2 weeks' time. So it's all about what the colony needs and how they take care of that young larva. So beekeepers can take that, and they take that knowledge, and we have beekeepers here in Iowa that specialize in rearing queens. And so they'll manipulate a colony into wanting to make tons and tons of queen cells. And then they'll have those queens, they'll divide those out into smaller tiny little boxes of bees and get those queens mated, and then they've got queens for sale to other beekeepers that need them. So there's an industry around just manipulating the bees into producing lots and lots of queens rather than drones. And again, same as every other answer, is just part of the fascination of beekeeping.
Awesome. We have a few questions that are about feeding bees specifically during the winter. So what do you
Sure.
feed the bees in the winter? And then do you put it in the hive or outside the hive?
Sure. Yeah, and this is part of beekeeping. It's not one of the more fun parts of beekeeping, but it certainly is necessary. And I think that the feeding of the bees, it has definitely increased over the years, more and more necessary. I think that's just related to the changes in the environment, the changes in diversity that are out there. You know, our season seems to be getting longer and longer in terms of just year to year, but I think the availability of good and proper bee forage doesn't seem to be getting longer and longer. It seems to be staying the same or so. And so we have more time in warm weather where the bees are really burning lots of calories, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there are plants in bloom for them. So they become more dependent on us to feed them, right? With the changes in the environment that they're in, they rely on the beekeeper more. And so when we have those boxes on, those honey supers, as I talked about, no beekeeper would ever dream of feeding bees because we don't want our artificial honey substitutes, you know, our sugar syrups ending up in honey that's going to be consumed for people, right? Us and our families and our customers. So through the middle of the season, we're very careful to not let any of our food end up in those honey boxes. That is honey, that is pure honey. That's all that's in those. But once those boxes come off, say in that late summer, you know, around state fair time, once those are off, we hope that the bees are going to collect enough food, and usually it works out. But in years that it doesn't, we can end up with colonies that might be starving by the time December rolls around if we're not paying attention. And so beekeepers can step in and check, and we can see how much food the bees are collecting late season, and the same thing for springtime, early spring, in overwintered colonies. And we can step in as beekeepers and feed when necessary. So some beekeepers will mix regular sugar, like table sugar, with water and make a concentrated syrup out of that. 2 parts sugar to 1 part water in the fall is a pretty common recipe. You might have to heat that up to even get it in the solution. And we can put that into feeders, all different shapes and sorts of feeders. But the idea is we present it to the bees, either usually inside the hive, and they'll take it from the feeder and store it in the combs the same as they would store their honey, right, in nature. Only it's not honey, it's sugar water. And then we can also, usually among bigger scale beekeepers, we can use corn syrup. And so, you know, we can buy corn syrup from processing plants, and the bees can take that and use that as well. Now, no beekeeper would argue that, you know, that's best for the bees, right? What we want is for nature to provide as much of this as possible, but it's really nice to have these practices, you know, available so that we can feed when necessary. Because, you know, even though we wouldn't argue that sugar is not the best food for bees, honey is the best food for bees. Well, starvation is the worst case, and so we can stop that by feeding early season and late season. And it also aids in spring buildup, right? If we're stimulating the colony by providing food for them, then they build up a little better, a little faster. And in the fall, you know, the last thing we want is to do is to lose colonies to starvation when we could have just spent a few bucks and burned some of our own calories and going out and feeding and taking care of them. And I think of it kind of as a pet, you know, not that I consider all my beehives to be pets, but you wouldn't have a dog and just think, well, you better forage for your own food. And you know, honeybees in theory should be able to do that on their own, but I feel like a lot of the changes to the environment, you know, make things very different from what they were several years ago. And so I feel like it is part of the responsibility of a beekeeper to step in and supplement nutrition when need be. Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, I have 2 more questions teed up, but there are so many more. So, Andy, when we get done with this, I am going to ask that you share the information to find out about beekeepers and beehives. But let's start with what is the best way to test bees for mites?
All right. Well, that's a good question. Let me, even before I get to that, let me just say we have a great beekeeping association here in Iowa called the Iowa Honey Producers Association. I'm glad you kind of put that in my head to mention these, because I certainly meant to bring up the honey producers. it's one of the oldest ag groups around. We've been around for well over 100 years now, and it's a great group of people. It's not just for the big, commercial operators. As you might think, oh, Iowa Honey Producers Association, that name sounds intimidating if I'm just a brand new hobby beekeeper. It's for everybody, and most of our members are small hobbyists. So we're a pretty thriving group. You can go to iowahoneyproducers.org is our website. You can go and check that out and find out all kinds of information. There's a monthly newsletter in there. We do classes, usually in the wintertime. We've missed them for this year. It's usually late January, February, and maybe into March. That's a good time to learn about beekeeping because this is the time of year that beekeepers are actually starting their hives. So, for anybody that's interested in starting out, I would encourage you to check out that Iowa Honey Producers Association website, maybe go to a meeting, and get involved with that group. We have a big presence at the state fair in the ag building above the Butter Cow. You can come up there if you go to, if we have a state fair this year, hopefully we will. Check us out up there. We also have local beekeeping clubs all over the state. It seems like there are more clubs every day. There's a Central Iowa Bee Club that's been around for quite a while, CIBA, Central Iowa Beekeeper Association, but there are bee clubs everywhere. And get involved in something on a local level. Facebook makes it pretty easy to seek out bee clubs near you. So get involved. There's no substitute for a local group or association. There's no substitute for having a knowledgeable mentor in your area. A YouTube video is a nice way to pick up a few things, but you never really know the quality of the information you're getting. And also, it's just all so local, right? Our beekeeping is so tied and intertwined into our seasons, the types of plants, the length of our days, what time spring starts of a year and what time falls, kind of winds things down for a year. All of it is so locally independent that there's just no substitute for getting involved. So I encourage anybody to do that. And of course, there's my office too. If you go to the IDALS, Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship webpage, you can find me pretty easily. So I wanted to address that. And then you asked the best way to sample mites. I almost forgot the actual question. To sample mites, I think an alcohol wash is the best way to do that, but there certainly are lots of different methods. I have done what's called an ether roll for years and years, and that's to collect about 300 bees in a jar. Not the queen, because you're going to kill these bees, right? We're going to sacrifice a few bees. We're going to sacrifice 300 bees to check on the quality of life for the other remaining 50,000 bees in the nest. So it's a very tiny percentage, but we don't want the queen in this jar. And in the ether roll test, we collect those 300 bees into a mason jar, and we can spray them with a little bit of starting fluid, and that'll kill them very quickly. And then the mites come off and stick to the jar. And so you might remember that picture from my slideshow of those mites kind of highlighted against the blue sky. That's an ether roll. We can count those mites very easily in that jar. Hopefully we'll see none or very few, but if you remember that picture, there were quite a number of them in there, those little black specks. And we can divide by 300, and that gives us our number of mites per 300 bees. We can figure out kind of a loose percentage on adult bees that way. And the alcohol wash test is very similar to that, only we just use rubbing alcohol and kind of shake and spin the mites off the bees in that rubbing alcohol. And so, killing the 300 bees to do this sample might make some people squeamish. There are also ways that, aren't maybe as precise, but maybe are good enough, where you can use sticky boards and other ways without killing those worker bees, right? There are definitely ways to assess how bad those mites are without killing bees. And the idea is just find something that you're comfortable with and do it so that you have at least a vague idea of what's going on with that particular pest, right? Because they will overtake a colony and kill it if you give them an opportunity. So we need to be responsible in checking and treating whenever necessary, and being smart with our treatment selections and timing. And it's really the nuts and bolts of beekeeping. I could get into the weeds pretty quickly about getting into details about mite treatment, but it's one of the biggest challenges in bees is keeping those mites maintained at a low population so the bees can be healthy and thrive. Yeah.
All right, Andy, we have one more question, and then we're going to wrap it up. And I also want to mention that this week is National Soil and Water Week. So we're celebrating that, and the theme is where would we be without pollinators? And our last question is about how the beekeepers interact with the bees. So, do the bees notice that you're there when you're caring for the hive? And how do they interact with you?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? um, they definitely know we're there. And so, one of the best traits a beekeeper can have is just develop in your knowledge of what they need and the seasonality of it all, so you have an idea of kind of how things should be and how things should look, so that you can get in and out of that hive pretty quickly and confidently without being rushed, without being in a scramble where you might be kind of rough with the bees, but very confident in your motions. And proper use of a smoker, that's a tool of a beekeeper. Usually if we're going to enter a hive, we're going to have a veil on to protect our face from stings, and we're going to have a smoker going that helps calm the bees down. And we can get into that hive and kind of assess it for how things are going in there, right? Do I have a healthy laying queen? Do I have a good brood pattern? Are they healthy? Do they have enough food? Do I need to add any extra boxes to keep up with the amount of food that they're bringing in? We can assess all these things. We can give a mite check. We can make sure that they're healthy and aren't overrun with parasites. We care for them, and then we get out of their way, right? And that's the second half of being a good beekeeper, is doing what you need to do, but then also leaving them alone so that they can do what they do best, right? Um, and so they know that we're there, and that's what that smoker is for. It kind of disrupts their communication B2B a little bit and reduces their alarm at our presence. It'd be pretty disruptive, if you're sitting in your home or office and then some giant creature comes and rips the roof off of your home and lets all this sunlight into this dark, cavity of our office or our living room or whatever, or our dining room table. And obviously that's why bees have stingers, right? Is to defend themselves and their nest and their food stores and all this. So, with confidence and experience, you can be that beekeeper that can get in there and do what needs to be done, and then get it all sealed right back up without disrupting the bees too much, without setting them on alarm into a defensive reaction. And then you leave them alone for a while, come back, maybe 10 days or 2 weeks later and check them again, that sort of a thing. And that's kind of there's an art and a science to beekeeping, and knowing how to manipulate the colony is like that perfect intersection of both. You need to know what to look for. You surely need to know how to get in there and get out, but that's the experience and the practice and the confidence that comes with just doing the same thing over and over again. So that's the joy of it all, is to get out there on a nice day like today, nice calmer day, wind wise than what we had yesterday, nice blue skies, get in there. They're in good moods. It's wonderful to be outside. Usually it's nothing but a joy.